Hello everyone, welcome back to the CGF 2021 edition of its virtual summit. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this session, which will be dedicated to a critical question for our industry, Leading Against Forced Labor, Act Now. And it's my pleasure to be accompanied by Mr. Emmanuel Faber, former chairman and CEO of Danone, and also outgoing Human Rights Coalition co-sponsor at the Consumer Goods Forum. Bonjour, Monsieur Faber.
Bonjour, Didier.
It's my pleasure to have you here. You have been supporting us for so many years in this Human Rights Coalition, and we really want to hear from you about what companies can do to also lead against forced labor. But before we start, I'd like for us to look at an extract of an interview we did with the executive director of Oxfam International. Oxfam International is an NGO that is effectively campaigning sometimes against our industry, but also acting as a critical friend, trying to help us improve and effectively get better on the challenges we face vis-à-vis human rights. So let's watch what Gabriela has to say to us in a very short extract. We know well that you work with many of our members, and well, we heard a lot about this relationship that you established with some of them, which is critical friend. What exactly do you mean by that, and how is this working?
So I think let me start by saying Oxfam believes in the power of business to do good, be it providing decent jobs, fostering innovation, and providing goods and services people need. But we also see everywhere the real negative impacts of business on the communities we work with, on inequality, on human rights, on our planet. So we see our role to get business to do less harm, to stop the harm, and pursue what really structurally improves people's lives. So we use a combination of tactics and approaches to get there. And that's to gain commitments from companies and also to change laws. So that's the campaigning, pushing the dial on the media through digital media and advertising. And so we try to ensure that our campaigning walks a very dynamic line. So it's hard-hitting enough to convey urgency so supporters will act and CEOs will listen, while at the same time not so aggressive that a company feels that whatever it does is not good enough, or that relationships with companies become too strained. So there's also evidence-based advocacy, which we engage deeply with companies and collaborate with influencers. There's the investor and shareholder activism that we do, for example, in the US. And there's also, there's many approaches. It's very multi-pronged. So one example I'm really very inspired about is our work in research and advocacy, where with two big corporate campaigns that we've held over the years. So it's Behind the Brands, which pushed for change with food and beverage companies. So it was Coca-Cola and Unilever and many others. And more recently now we're working with Behind the Barcodes, which is about supermarkets such as Walmart and Tesco. So with both campaigns, we've always included a very clear and evidence-based justification of our targeted companies, along with clearly highlighting best practice. So what is our approach really here? It's about doing what it takes to ensure a company starts taking structural commitments to real change and then implements them. And we will engage with them not only to monitor, but to really ensure that they follow through, and also as an advisor or partner on how best to do it. So this is how critical and friend comes to be in practice. So one of our take-home message to business leaders at this forum is we want to be a force for good. We want companies to be a force for good. And we totally get it, that there are fine lines to tread here, and these can be very uncomfortable. But I'm witness, and many are, of how building respectful relationships, and that means giving advance notice, giving companies a chance to comment on our findings, publicly celebrating success together, we've gained trust with companies. So there's ways in which we can work to be really transformative together. In fact, many companies tell us they really appreciate Oxfam's sincerity in how we put issues on their agenda. And most crucially, as a result, we together have been able to drive change for people and really value chains across the world.
So, Monsieur Faber, it's actually quite interesting to hear Gabriela from Oxfam International telling us that they see their role as being overly critical towards our members, our industry, and also to help us being a force for good. In my role as director of the CGF Human Rights Coalition, you, as my co-sponsor, have always been pushing for us to engage more with stakeholders. How can leaders understand what Gabriela just said from a business perspective and take the best out of it?
Well, I think it's interesting to listen to what Gabriela said, because to use your words, Didier, they are both critical friends, and she says we want to act as a force for good, and in the same time they're ready to be overly and openly critical about what we do. And I think this is the essence of what this coalition is about, which is that Consumer Goods Forum was created to be as a force for good, and how, as an industry, we could act with a better impact on the world. We need those critical friends, and they would not be friends if they were not critical. They would be useless if they were not. And so I think it tells really the fact that there is a business case for consumer good industry because we have brands. Gabriela was mentioning the Behind the Brand campaign, which is a very powerful way for them to simply name and shame, let's call it this way. But if they don't, consumers will do, or other organizations one way or the other, because when we speak about civil society, the particular special aspect of our industry is that civil society is actually our consumers. So they have a direct say on how they want to behave versus our brands. So listening to people who actually advise not only civil society, but our consumers, like Oxfam and many others, I think is critical for us as leaders to embark. And so if you associate that with the fact that this campaigning and overall is pushing for more regulation, which is currently happening, there is really both the good and the bad reasons, but there is a combination of reasons why these human rights issues, and in particular forced labor, should be very high on the agenda for companies like ours.
And so forced labor, we talk a lot about it. We talk even more about it now. It's a daunting reality, 25 million trapped in forced labor, 12 million that could be within our value chains. Technically, we are here to help companies and business leaders to become force for good when it comes to fighting forced labor. We launched a coalition a couple of months ago at International Human Rights Day, and we had been working with you on that for quite some time before. But what do you think over the last months have been the greatest achievements, if any, of this group of companies that have committed to eradicate forced labor?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd like to really thank those members, the 20 plus member companies of the coalition. And maybe I should start by saying that even way before we started this effort as a coalition last year, CGF and the consumer goods industry was, I think, 4 years ago, probably the first of all industries to voice out publicly a commitment to work on this daunting issue. And I think it's important to just mention that, because this is the leadership of many of our predecessors that we are currently leveraging with this coalition. CGF board made a clear point on forced labor already several years ago. So the fact that it's now a coalition is also a factor of how, as an industry, we've evolved towards the fact that we needed to be campaigning ourselves. And when I say campaigning ourselves, I mean by us, but to us, the rest of the board, the rest of the membership, the 400 members of the CGF around the world. So this is only a few months ago, and I really don't think we can speak about achievements at this point in time, but really much more about the endeavors, the level of energy that we see in the membership about this issue. I think the realization as well that more and more regulations are going to be here and will be basically forcing us to act on these topics in a manner which, of course, if we anticipate that, we'll be able to do it in a way that makes sense for the industry as a whole. And there is no point probably, but still mentioning, I think, those regulations, the Border Protection Act in the US that could prevent the government from letting goods where there could be evidence or suspicion of forced labor in the complex supply chains that we have could be a big topic for literally any of the large companies that operate as part of the CGF today. The same in France with the loi de vigilance, devoir de vigilance, that was implemented already several years ago. The Modern Slavery Act in the UK, now the HRDD directives that is coming into force in the EU, and many more to come. So what I think we are trying to do with the coalition is really to ensure that we align, that we work together to make sure that we are anticipating those moves and being able to respond efficiently.
But interestingly, you mentioned all of these regulations that were not in place 4 years ago when we started and launched a resolution against forced labor. Yet it seems that the more regulations there are, the more companies get committed. But is that the only way forward for companies to take the lead on the eradication of forced labor, or is there other ways to convince additional companies to effectively join the journey, which is complicated but which is so necessary?
Well, I think that forced labor, in a way, is the fundamental issue of them all. In a way, the mother of all the rest. You cannot pretend to be sustainable. You cannot pretend to be a force for good if you are not able to say and guarantee that there is no forced labor in your own operations. And today, I cannot guarantee that in the operation of the company I was running still a few months ago. And it's very hard for any of our large or small companies to do that, because in order to do this, you need to make sure that you have a program that tracks that in a manner that is absolutely granular. And we're speaking about big operations, complex operations. So it's very, very important that we work on our own operations as we have pledged in the coalition. And the extension to the supply chain is absolutely critical as well. So first of all, I think it's a fundamental. It's a fundamental because our employees and the more educated employees and the young managers who tomorrow will be the leaders of our businesses are requesting this. They are voting not only for a salary, but also for the values and the purpose that our organizations stand for and the brands that they support stand for. I mentioned about the consumers, but the truth is the same for customers. And my co-sponsor, Steve Rowe, the CEO of Marks & Spencer, could speak as much as how important it is for retailers to also make sure that their suppliers comply on topics such as these ones. So it's even a matter of license to operate at the end of the day for a brand in the consumer space to be able to respond on the efforts that we're making to eradicate forced labor out of our supply chains as a whole.
So technically, yes, it's about practicing what we preach and inviting our suppliers to also make human rights due diligence the norm. But the reality is that we can't do it alone. That's why we work as a collective. But technically, if I understand you well, the first partners of this necessary change within our companies will be the employees themselves. But who else from the external spheres would you effectively recommend us to work with to be able to drive this necessary change and make human rights due diligence, HRDD, the norm today?
Yes, I think if this was a simple problem, we wouldn't even be talking about it. The fact is that we need more of Oxfams and other critical friends. NGOs, non-for-profits are there to campaign, but also to support. I know of some of the work that Oxfam did in Indonesia, for instance, 20 years ago, with some of our industry colleagues in the consumer space that was really granular in plantations, in factories, and this is where non-profit organizations can help and support us. The second is unions, because unions are the eyes and potentially the management's eyes if we're ready to work with them as a force for good and together, not only in our own operations, but also in the supply chains. So if you think about the international unions, IUTA, for the agricultural space and the food space, they can really be true partners in checking what is happening in the due diligence of our supply chains. That's another example. The ILO would be a third one. The migration organizations of the UN and multilateral are there as well on topics such as, apart from the HRDD topics on forced labor, the whole topic of responsible recruitment, because there would not be forced labor if there was not a problem at the recruitment level. People paying for working, for instance, people being deprived of their passport when they go and seek for a job, people indebted to their employer because of the way they were hired to start with. So all of this is an ecosystem, and those agencies that I was mentioning are an ecosystem that is extremely important for the coalition to work with. Closer to us, there are other international coalitions of businesses that are working on more inclusive growth. The Business for Inclusive Growth initiative that gathers 50 multinational companies powered by the OECD is precisely right now working on topics such as living wage, such as responsible restructuring, the HRDD directive in EU, that are also crossing bridges with what we do at the Coalition Against Forced Labor in CGF. And within CGF, it's very clear that we absolutely need a coalition like the one that we're running, because it's a place where CEOs can speak freely. It's very, very hard to get a CEO to speak publicly on those topics, because our lawyers are saying us we shouldn't, our general counsels would tell us we shouldn't, our social media managers would say, well, no, if you start saying about this, you will have a backlash on the social media, etc., etc. And they may be right. But therefore, we need a place where we can have this safe dialogue as to how difficult it is, how challenging it is, and how we can progress. So these are the various circles through which the coalition is actually making progress. And I think this is, beyond the question of regulation, really the way to make progress one by one, slow steps, not making so much noise, but being clear on the commitments, the pilots, as we have in Malaysia, for instance, on palm oil, etc., that are, I think, the concrete ways of getting confidence as leaders that we can move the needle in reality on the ground through these examples, for instance.
And so you mentioned a lot of partnerships. You know that we just signed a multi-year partnership with the Fair Labor Association and the International Organization for Migration, just to target also these big evils that pertains to forced labor, like the lack of responsible recruitment. People don't understand, but today the reality of many workers worldwide is that they would pay to get a job opportunity. Now, speaking about it is difficult, and it takes a lot of leadership from our CEOs to be able to do that. The CGF itself tries to provide this safe space to effectively talk about it and go for actions that we can collectively agree upon. What's the role of governments in there? And how can we get governments, both from the European countries, the US, but also governments in countries we source from, to tag along on this journey and become partners vis-à-vis the eradication of forced labor?
Well, it's a fundamental topic to get governments in it. They are moving, and I think the sourcing countries' governments will also move as the receiving countries' governments are moving. So we have example in Europe, for instance, or actually in France, where the duty of vigilance law was applied and led to changes in companies' practices that then meant that the unions locally, and therefore then the governments locally, had to understand that unless they would be moving to some sort of a rule locally, their country would gradually lose its competitiveness as a country of sourcing for a region like France, and broader speaking, with now the directive on human rights due diligence to be voted in Europe, soon. I don't know if it's a matter of months or year, but it's not a matter of several years. Then it means the whole market of Europe, like 400 million consumers, might not be able to be tapped by those countries. So I absolutely believe that there is a critical role for governments. The G7 is taking some action, and we see that with Business for Inclusive Growth, for instance, but they need to have host countries, like India being a host country to the G7, for instance. Extending that to the G20 is fundamental. And the agenda of those governments is gradually moving, those multilateral organizations and events, is gradually moving to the social space as we speak. We've really seen that over the last several years. And I think we should, as businesses, we should encourage them in going in that direction. There is always this debate, by the way, at the CGF, which we had when we launched the coalition system a year and a half ago, whether we are an advocacy group or not. Exactly. And we said we are a force for good, but not an advocacy group. Well, I think as CGF, it's probably the right thing, and that's the board's decision. But I think within the coalition, we need leaders that are ready to advocate to government where we want to go, because the best thing to progress on these matters is when we create a level playing field that is meant to be happening through regulation for the entire industry to work with the same rules.
But so technically, if I hear you well, we need to be bolder, probably more ambitious, but also be much more open to try to get governments on the same page that we are. Do you feel that over the last years this juncture is effectively happening? Or do we still struggle to effectively cooperate versus oppose each other with laws that sometimes try to penalize companies, whereas we are trying to show in good faith that we are effectively trying to walk the talk?
Well, it's probably everyone's judgment here, but you know me for a long time. I tend to be a guy that looks at the half full glass, and I've seen really things evolving on this. I think, again, I think forced labor, which is, call it modern slavery, it's as simple as that, is such a difficult human topic that it can easily be a taboo, and it is a taboo. It's a taboo for business leaders to recognize that there might be forced labor. And we know, I am sure that there is forced labor in our supply chain. So it's very difficult to recognize and start until you recognize it fundamentally, and you're not going to solve that very quickly. It's very hard to say it out. The same on government. The day governments recognize that in the informal economy, there in this region here or there is forced labor, it's extremely difficult for them to recognize that and yet continue to act, whether they are democracy or not. What I have found really interesting is that when we find a way to share with a bit of humility that we're facing that, and it's not a simple case, it's, everyone is responsible. I would dare to say that consumers are responsible for it. Asking the lowest price possible. There is nothing as cheap jobs don't exist. So cheap price means cheap jobs, and that doesn't exist. So, we need to recognize that we are under this pressure and that we have a collective responsibility to respond to it. And it's not a finger-pointing exercise to any individual company, because we know only if we do it together on some big commodities, one by one, some transversals and verticals, only after several years we will be able, and many years we will be able to do this. The companies that have taken the leadership on these topics, they recognize that even on things like living wage in their own organization, it took them 3 to 5 years to achieve that. So I think this is the kind of time frame that we should be using, and that's the one we're using for our own operations in the Forced Labor Coalition, 25 in our operations. But going into the supply chain will take more time. And my strong belief is that the more we will be transparent about it, the speedier it will be for us to move and act. Because what kills the issue is the secret and the taboo that we do not discuss it. So the first thing is to face the reality that there is forced labor in our supply chains.
So if I listen well, to act now on leading against forced labor, first start acknowledging that there is a problem, possibly in your company, certainly in your supply chains. We're celebrating the 10 years of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights as we speak, and yet so many people still don't know that we have today more slaves than we had during the 400 years of transatlantic slavery. So recognizing those facts can be an essential point to get leaders to act. As your role as co-sponsor, what would be, in your final words, the key takeaway you would like other leaders, existing members of the CGF Human Rights Coalition, and possibly other industry leaders to get from you, so that we can be inspired and hopefully multiply the number of leaders acting against forced labor?
Well, yes, I mean, actually, that would be my takeaway. My takeaway is, having worked on these issues for several years within CGF, having participated in the launch of the coalition 6 months ago, more or less, I can see already the benefits of being able to talk about it. We have a safe place to talk about it. And this is fundamental. So I would really invite everyone in this audience to join this coalition. It's not a coalition that's big enough yet. We need more than 20 or 25 companies to succeed. But I really believe, conversely, that those companies that will join will address an issue which is critical, super hard. We will work together to solve it, and we'll probably in 3-5 years' time get a huge return on that investment. At the time when things will become much more public, they might actually come much bigger, much faster. Look at just what happened with plastics, for instance. Just imagine that the same would happen next year. You'd much better be in this platform of the coalition, working with all these multilaterals, with Oxfam and many others, than being left aside of it. So join. That's my takeaway. Please join this coalition.
So as per the summit's title this year, what now when it comes to forced labor? Well, just act now. Thanks a lot, Emmanuel. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure,
Thanks
Didier,
again,
as usual.